Before we jump into the app, quick reminder that nothing on Bell Curve is financial advice. Everything is just a meme. Hope you guys enjoy.
A lot of times people really, like, founders really truly want to create these public goods, and it's really important to them, but they don't think through what happens when they have investors and token holders who actually have control over the public goods via this governance and economic right. And I think that's where things go a little bit haywire.
All right, buddy. It's going to be a good one today. We're talking to Larry Sukernik and Hsue from Reverie. Really interesting. So we had a really good first episode with Hsue and Chris on. We talked all about, they give us basically the high level idea of product governance fit or business governance fit as Chris wrote that piece. Next, we're kind of moving and talking more like tactically, right, about what some of this stuff actually means. So just some background for folks. Larry and Derek run a firm called Reverie. They're probably one of the most kind of hands-on, like practitioner-focused groups that actually interfaces with DAOs on a daily basis. So they're much more qualified, honestly, than you and I in many regards to discuss like kind of what are the pros and cons of how DAOs are structured today, and what their sort of recommended changes are going forward. And we specifically talk about kind of map out, what corporate governance kind of looks like today, how it might be different in DAO land, and then we get a little bit prescriptive and offer some advice for DAOs towards the end of the episode. But and you get in there too. You're a maker delegate, so we heard
I was going to say, you stole my thunder in this intro. You took the what are we talking about? You took the who are we talking to? You took the who did we just talk to in the last episode?
Yeah, you got in the mix. You got in there. You're a delegate at maker. We heard some on the ground experience from you.
I'm really bringing nothing to the table. All right, let's. This is a really good episode. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get into it.
All right, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. We've got Larry Sukernik and Derek Hsue, the co-founders at Reverie. Fellas, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, guys, really appreciate it. We've got a lot of ground to cover, as you guys could probably tell from the mega document / novel that I sent over your way before recording here. But I'd love to kind of start high level here and get your guys' thoughts on the current state of DAO governance. So maybe as a jumping off point, Larry, I've kind of heard you make this analogy of just setting context here that people kind of bring their past experience to them when they're looking at DAO governance. So if you kind of come from a political background, you look at this more through the lens of, poli-sci and how governments kind of work. And if you come from more of a builder kind of corporate America standpoint, you kind of see elements of corporate governance that should be introduced to DAOs. So can you kind of address that idea of people, bringing their work from home, so to speak, and like, what is your mental model for thinking about DAO governance?
Yeah, happy to riff on that a little bit. I mean, the way I think about this stuff is there's all sorts of mental models for pretty much anything in life, right? Whether it's governance, capital allocation, design. People when they're learning about new concepts, particularly complicated concepts, they tend to reason through analogy, and so mental models are a very easy way to think about new complicated things. And in my experience and in our Reverie's experience with DAOs, the two common mental models for governance in DAO land are really one, hey, let's govern these things as countries, right? So whether it's a democracy sort of thing or dictatorship, but that's like one mental model, right? And the second one is corporate governance, right? So having the same sort of mental models you apply to companies, right? With shareholders, with the board, and with investors and managers, that sort of mental model applies as well. And those, I would say, are the two common ones you see in DAO land. There are others, to be sure, but I'd say those are the most frequent ones. And they're basically just mental models, right? These are ways that people think about how to make governance decisions in the crypto space.
So probably just reasoning by analogy is almost always wrong, but again, they can provide kind of helpful ballast points, right, or almost goalposts for how to think about things. So when you're looking out there into the world of the DAOs that exist today, how would you kind of make that distinction in between like governance in like a liberal democracy on like a government type scale versus corporate governance? Like, where is it? What are sort of the principles of both, and where does it make sense to apply those different principles?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I think the answer is it depends, right, on the project. My general gut sense for this stuff, and I've shared this before on our podcast, I Pledge Allegiance, is basically the governance structure should fit the product. So if the product benefits from having, a very slow moving governance structure, right? So take like Ethereum, for example, right? Ethereum pitches itself as a neutral base layer platform that's censorship resistant. Well, if that's the case, then it probably benefits from having a very slow governance process. That way, developers can know if I'm building on Ethereum, the ground is not going to change under me, right? It's not just going to shift overnight. But if the product is something like an app, right, that benefits from rapid iteration, upgrading, the product and fixing bugs, then the governance structure probably should look more like, a company, right, or a dictatorship where you can make decisions very quickly. And so having some sense for what governance structure fits my product, I think is really important to get it right.
Derek, can I have you piggyback on Larry's point there? Do you think that is set from the beginning? Like when you set out to build something, you're like, all right, this is a product DAO, and it, because it's a product DAO, it should be governed like this, or it's like, okay, in year 1 and 2, we're focused on like wide products, so maybe it's like very centralized decision making. Then in year 3 and 4, it changes. Like, how do you think about that? The governance changing as like the maturation changes.
Yeah, great question. I definitely think that governance structures evolve over time for projects just by natural forces, by natural evolution, as there's more and more stakeholders. Like obviously the decision-making process and the debates, they change. And I think that's how it should be. I think early on, pre-product market fit, you probably don't need lots of voices in the room contributing to every single decision. So again, happy to go into more specifics, but I think broadly speaking, like depending on the life cycle of the project, the same governance structure can make a lot of sense or make no sense at all. So
I think maybe there are a couple of different, like if you almost had like a 2x2 matrix of different, like some of the two of the important factors are like maturity, right? So is this a 6-month-old startup, right? Or is this a 10-year-old type corporation? Nothing really isn't in crypto is 10 years old outside of Bitcoin, but there's kind of like the timing and maturation on one axis, and then there's also closeness to base layer infrastructure on the other. So maybe you would put Bitcoin and Ethereum as extremely close, like almost like the bottom layer of infrastructure, which is depending on how you conceptualize those two projects, kind of like a store of value money type thing, and then like an IP preservation type system on the other side of things, and then you can kind of layer up from there. So maybe like one layer up from Bitcoin and Ethereum, you might put like a maker. Right, type protocol. I'd be curious if you guys, like one thing that has come out of our interview with Hsue and Chris, previously was different governance structures are appropriate for based on where the protocol sits on the infrastructure layer. So I'd love to get your thoughts on if you agree with that concept, and if so, if you've given any thought to like categorizing, what are the different layers of financial infrastructure that we're kind of building here?
I think the intuition there is quite sound, right? The intuition being if it's lower level infrastructure, it probably is being built upon by other developers, right? By other people in the ecosystem. And if that is the case, then they probably don't want that infrastructure to change very quickly, because if it does, right, it's going to bubble up all the way to the top, and that's not good. And so the intuition is, hey, if a lot of people are building on this infrastructure, it probably should have a very slow moving governance structure so that people can actually depend on it and they won't wake up one morning and the whole thing is different, right? And the higher level we go, the fewer people depend on it and there's fewer dependencies, right? We can probably make more rapid iterations on the governance structure. So I totally agree with that approach.
How about if I could like poke you to maybe, I don't know if you've thought of this, or I'll just put you on the spot here a little bit, but if you thought about what those layers kind of might look like maybe as a jumping off point, right? Do you agree that kind of Maker and maybe like a Uniswap or Aave compound kind of sit on that first layer? And if so, like how many different layers are appropriate? Like Hsue actually made the point that the analog in corporations might be something like utility companies, right? Which you have like corporate governance for utilities, but they're almost like kind of semi-nationalized, right? There's an appropriate profit that utilities companies can make every year. Say, hey, we want to invest in X amount of CapEx at this corporate profit, because those are like natural monopoly type companies, but they're regulated and their governance looks pretty different because we all need power, right? The government has basically said we want all of our citizens to have power. So have you kind of thought about those sorts of classifications or analogs in crypto specifically?
I struggle with this because in any given year, I feel like, well, first of all, to take a step back, all this stuff, all the layers are very emergent, right? And so, if we look at what we thought are the layers 2 years ago, um, a lot of those layers kind of, moved around. Some went up the stack, some went down the stack, some stayed in the stack, and some just disappeared, right? And so that layer cake, it's very, I think, difficult in any given time to say, okay, here's how it will actually cement and grow over the coming years. So my personal approach is just to look and see, and not to overthink it, and not to have strong opinions on which layers are here to stay and which layers are actually gonna go away.
How do you guys think about the tension sometimes in between, like, let's look at Maker as, let's caveat it and say it looks like a very base layer protocol today. Maybe we don't know exactly where it falls in the stack, but Maker is supposed to produce a stablecoin DAI, right? That's the product, and it has a, on the one hand, you maybe want to minimize the surface layer, the surface level area for governance, right? Because it's supposed to do a very simple thing. On the other hand, the competitive advantage is kind of managing a balance sheet and managing risk, which is actually a very complicated thing to do. So how do you think about that kind of tension in between minimizing governance surface area versus actually the value add of a protocol like Maker is doing something very complex beneath the surface?
Yeah, happy to jump in. I think, again, I think you highlighted both ends of the spectrum really well. Like, on the one hand, it's obvious that MakerDAO, if it wants to survive long term, it has to be resilient to attack. And governance can be a liability. I think the more quickly something changes, obviously, the more potential downside risk there is. But at the same time, yeah, if you, like, MakerDAO they're where they are because they were one of the first projects to launch in terms of Ethereum and DeFi. So they were well positioned from the beginning. But I think going forward, if they want to maintain their positioning, they're not going to do it by simply just surviving. I think that's probably the most important thing. But there still is innovation that remains. There's remaining balance sheet management that has to be optimized, and over a long enough time frame, if you only care about survival, like, you'll fall behind on some of these other parameters, right? Like, MakerDAO is still only at this point 5 years old, which is a long time in crypto, but in the grand scheme of things, pretty young, right? So I think, crypto gives us all a different sense of timing and longevity, but I think it's really important to just keep that in context.
Yeah, I've had a kind of similar thought, and I think sometimes where this debate centers around for me is almost this idea of public goods. So one idea that you kind of hear sometimes even within the scaling roadmap of something like Uniswap, and leaving aside the regulatory component and lens through which you could look at this, which I want to get your take on later, is this idea that, okay, so Uniswap v3 is basically, we're going to stop really building much post that, right? That's kind of a public good that we want at the base layer there, this liquidity provision kind of DEX that other people can build on. And then we can build products and services on top of that. But if you dig into the assumption there, it's this idea that Uniswap v3 is the last layer, right? And for whatever reason, we've decided, there was v1 and now there's v2, and v3 is basically good, and that's going to be the public good. Whereas you could take another angle and say, well, actually, providing liquidity and creating, stealing market share on the DEX level is still a wildly profitable business, right? There's probably good capital allocation decisions to be made at that layer. Why have we surrendered building at that layer? It seems very unlikely to me that in 2 years, right, we've built the best DEX that we possibly can. So can you talk about a little bit how you think about this idea of, public goods and where that enters the conversation as well?
I think, like, in most cases, if the thing has a token, it's not really a public good, right? Like, all of a sudden you have token holders who are the owners of the thing, right? If there's a governance right that the token holders have, they probably have, control over certain critical parameters. And they're going to want to, whether they tell you or not, they're going to want to extract rents, right? And I think that's not applicable to all projects, certainly, but to the grand majority. And The public good stuff. My sense is a lot of times people really like founders really truly want to create these public goods, and it's really important to them, but they don't think through what happens when they have investors and token holders who actually have control over the public goods via this governance and economic right. And I think that's where things go a little bit haywire.
Larry, how do you think about, or to Derek, how do you think about just who you're optimizing for, right? Because Mike brought up public goods. You're like, yeah, well, when you have a token, like it's not really a public good because now you have these token holders. And it reminded me of that piece that you guys wrote, Musings on Governance, where you're just talking about how there's a bunch of different, there are a bunch of things that you're trying to optimize for. And sometimes you see people trying to optimize maybe too much for like the community or for like open DAOs. But really what you should be optimizing for is like building amazing products and shareholder value, right? Which looks a lot like what we optimize for in corporate governance. So I'd love to get both of your takes here. Like, how do you think about what you're actually trying to optimize for? And have you seen examples of folks optimizing for the wrong thing?
Yeah, I think like everyone has their own opinions on. I think most people would agree that token holders matter, users matter, community matters. Like all stakeholders matter. There's a lot of disagreement on who's most important and in what order and what percentages. But the one belief I do have is, and I think on that point, like what's most important, like you could talk all day about that and we wouldn't get anywhere. But I think what will be true over, again, a long enough time frame is the protocols that care about the right one or two stakeholders over the rest. They'll be the ones to actually survive and maintain their relevancy. So it's not about what we should care about. It's about what will happen and what the protocols prioritize. So to me, again, it comes down to users. I think if users don't remain on your platform, regardless of what you use, community doesn't matter, token holders don't matter, partnerships don't matter, like none of that matters. I think, yeah, if users are there, the other things will generally follow. Obviously, there's exceptions and it changes like depending on the life cycle. But I think by and large, like if you don't have users, you don't really have anything.
How do you think about, one of the innovations of crypto that a lot of people tout as being one of the big benefits is like alignment between token holders and users, right? So like Web3 Uber or something, right? Uber on the blockchain, you would have users, the users of Uber and the early shareholders of Uber might be one and the same, right? And a lot of people espouse this as being one of the best things about crypto. Maybe on the other side of the bull market, you're seeing that this isn't maybe necessarily the case oftentimes. I'm just curious, maybe, I don't know who to ask this question to, but how do you think about just this dichotomy between like users and token holders and the overlap? And Derek, I agree with you, you're optimizing for the user, but like how much of the overlap is there for the token holders as well?
I think, I think as long as token holders are the only ones with like clearly defined governance power, it will be an uphill battle for users to have influence on the protocol. But I do think users have a lot of influence, even in protocols where it's like on-chain governance and only token holders have a say. But I do think over a long enough time frame, yeah, it's really important for users to have like a direct say, whether it's formal or informal. I think Lido's ST-ETH dual governance is a great example of this, where LDO token holders currently have a lot of power. And again, if Lido continues growing, there's a lot of downside risk for users and ETH holders that are using Lido to stake. So I do think over time, protocols should strongly consider implementing safeguards on what token holders can do and the types of veto rights that your users can have. Today, most of that veto right is informal. But I think, yeah, it's an experiment, I think, worth running. Is giving your average user more formal rights and methods in governance.
Just to jump on what Derek said because I agree with it. I mean, you look at like some of the companies we grew up with, right? Like Uber and maybe Seamless and Grubhub, right? And I remember when they first got started, I was like, wow, this product is awesome. It's super cheap, way cheaper than the status quo, right? Or like a taxi or like a
Mm-hmm.
delivery that a restaurant would have. But that's totally changed as these companies actually became incumbents, right? And I find, Ubers are very expensive now, probably more than taxis are, at least in New York where I live. And the same with, delivery for food. And so I think there's this like general pattern that happens. Up and coming companies, they're like, we fight for the user, right? Once they gain the user, they're like, well, we got to make money, right? Why did we do this fight for the user thing if we didn't make any money sort of thing, right? So they start becoming extractive. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? I think that's just kind of a feature of capitalism, right? There's always this, you know, uh, chaos, right, in the system. And it really leads to innovation because the incentive is always to fight for the user for the first 5 to 10 years. Then once you have the user, you start trying to make money. And I think we'll probably see a very similar dynamic with crypto companies that basically say, "Hey, we're not going to be extractive. Let's hold them to the fire 5, 10 years from now and see what actually happens."
I have a maybe just because my brain sort of works like a 5-year-old's. I'd love to maybe like try to simplify and get a almost like a mental map for what we're talking about here, which is when I think about corporate governance, right? And we're talking about different stakeholders here. There are kind of 3, maybe 4, really that matter, right? There are the shareholders; those are the principals of the company. There are the managers or the operators, and those are the agents, and they're supposed to be acting on behalf of the principals, the shareholders. And then there's a board of directors, right, which is they act as fiduciaries to the shareholders, and they're supposed to sort of be in between, right, and watch the managers and operators on behalf of the shareholders. I suppose you could also add users, right, that as a stakeholder, but they basically get no voice in corporate governance, so I'm not really going to include them. I would love for you guys, who do you think the most important stakeholders are in our kind of crypto DAO land, right? If you kind of map out in the same way for corporate governance, how it looks today in DAOs. So like most important stakeholders, or like each stakeholder and like relatively what their role is and what they do.
I'll take a stab at this. I think if you empirically look at the evidence today, token holders have the majority of power and are the most active ones actually participating in governance in terms of proposing proposals, voting on them, like even chiming in, right? Like by definition, they are the only ones that have formal power. So I think token holders have the most influence today. A lot of the time you need a pretty large minimum to even propose a vote, which gates others from really participating. I think, yeah, users are the second category, and generally, again, this is a pretty broad generalization, but I don't see your average user that doesn't hold tokens, like I don't see their incentive to really participate in governance. If they have a problem with the product or the app, they'll be in the Discord or the Telegram, like asking that question, not necessarily participating in your on-chain governance forum. So I think, yeah, there's others. Obviously, there's team members, there's builders on top of the protocols that I think obviously are all highly relevant and do a lot. But yeah, I would that's sort of my general thinking.
My sense is it depends on, just like it depends on in the Web2 world, the company we're talking about. I think here it depends on the project we're talking about too. But I think the general mental model I have for this is if the switching costs are very high, right, then the token holders have a lot more leverage over the users. If the switching costs are low, users have way more leverage because they could vote with their feet. They're not happy with the product. They think it's extractive. They're like, screw it. We're going to go use another product, right? Which is why monopolies, right, typically have really high switching costs, which is why they're very regulated, right? Because, governments know monopolies could just, extract rents and users can't really vote with their feet. So That's how I generally think of it. And obviously companies in the traditional world that have higher switching costs, they're valued way higher by markets than companies with really low switching costs because, users churn much more quickly and companies don't have the ability to increase prices as much as a company that has really high switching costs for their products.
I'd be curious, like one stakeholder that we haven't really talked about, and maybe this isn't a formal enough group, or it's still in its kind of nascent stages, but one is kind of delegates. I'd love to also start talking about some of the proposed sort of structures that DAOs have advocated for that look a little bit more like corporate governance. Hsue kind of talked about in our first episode what he proposed at Maker. I know you guys have proposed a pretty interesting structure at Orca, so I'd love to get in some of those examples. But I would love to get your understanding of what, because right now in Maker, and I'm talking, Jason, I know you're a Maker delegate, so maybe I can get your opinion here to weigh in on this. But, I think delegates are being asked to increasingly weigh in on an enormous quantity of issues and an increasing complexity of issues as well. And historically, there haven't been great compensation structures. So you're starting to hear almost the advocating for like a professional class of delegates where it's almost like a full-time role with compensation to weigh in on these sorts of things. I'd be curious to get an understanding from you guys of like what role delegates play in some of these larger DAOs.
I can take a stab at this one first. I mean, you're right. Like, there's this trend happening, right, where delegates are really being charged with a lot of the decision making, right, because people delegate their votes to them, right, because most people don't have the time or interest in browsing governance forums. Like, it's very time consuming to get the information to know how to vote. And so they're basically outsourcing that to delegates whose job it is to read what's happening on the forums, get a sense for what decisions are being made and how to vote for those decisions. My general sense on this is like we could have a world where we're going to have these professional delegates just like we have proxy advisors essentially, right? But that would be a shame. I think there is no better person situated to vote than the actual owner, right? The person who actually owns the assets, right? Because it's their money, right? The moment you introduce principal agent problems, right, where you delegate your power, your governance power to someone who's not going to face the risk of loss, you will have all sorts of fuzzy decision making that you see in the traditional world too. So I think that is probably the path of least resistance, but I don't know if it'll necessarily lead to the best decision making.
I have a thought on this as well, but I'll answer my own kind of question here because I've had before Blockworks, I was a consultant, right? So sort of very professional services. And I can tell you, the way I thought about solving problems as a consultant is extremely different about how I think about solving problems as an operator of a business. And let me caveat this by saying, I know Reverie is, I want to give you guys a chance to talk about it at the end, but when I'm talking about professional services, I'm not really referring to you guys because you're much more practitioner and like have stake in the game and think about getting in the weeds. But when I started being a consultant, I thought you were going to solve really hard problems because that's what it's billed as, right? Like the most challenging problems in business, you get to go solve a whole bunch of them. And to some degree, some degree, it's not necessarily true. In a lot of cases, you're brought in kind of as insurance by your stakeholder, right? So like a VP of marketing wants or sales or operations who wants a big change done. They want to bring in consultants to basically, look at the data, but make sure the data says what I say, right? So that I can go to the board and say, hey, I got these independent guys to come to this decision. But even more so than that, as an independent party, I didn't really think about a lot. I thought more about what would sound good or what would be a good narrative or what would look good on slides versus what I actually thought would work. And it's just a very different, maybe if you've had experience acting as a consultant versus like a proprietor and owner, like maybe other people have had this experience. So I hear these arguments about a professional class of delegates and I get it. You have to be compensated but at the same time, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me because you're sort of acting a professional class of delegates to make decisions for which it just doesn't, I don't love it. I'll be honest. It's the end of that take there. But I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on that perspective.
I mean, who would you have like make how would you set it up different? Would you take away the delegate system, Mike, or how would you?
I guess it's about properly incentivizing people who are best who are best suited to make the decision. So right now, I think one of the big problems is this like 1-to-1 voting based on your token ownership that kind of exists. I just don't see that. I don't see how that can continue and good decisions can be made, especially in these early stage protocols.
I mean, yeah, it reminds me of something that I keep going back to this piece because I really liked it. That Reverie wrote, the Musings of Governance. There was one piece that was like, we'd much rather participate in a DAO with 10 motivated 10% owners than a DAO with 10,000 lackadaisical 0.01% owners, right? The outcome in the former case is likely to be far more positive than the outcome in the latter case. And so like in this, it's a related idea, right? Because in I think what you see right now is DAOs really pushing to get as many people, as many contributors as possible. And then what you get is another thing that was talked about in the piece, which is there's a bunch of conflicting interests. And then B, you get as many contributors, and then they're like, I don't want to actually vote. I'm going to delegate my vote. And then you just get these like this cohort of like these delegates who they actually aren't really experts on what's going on in the protocol oftentimes. They're just these like big brands in the space. And then you just start looking almost like, I've noticed that diligence on votes in protocols is very similar to VC diligence, where you'll be like in how a lot of VCs do due diligence is like angel investors. Why does an angel invest in a deal? They're like, oh, because like these funds are involved. Okay, well, why is the fund involved? Oh, because Andreessen's leading it, and Andreessen has $4 billion, and they must have done this great due diligence. And that's how a lot of VC due diligence happens, is like there's a remarkable lack of due diligence. Well, in like MakerDAO, how oftentimes it happens is like, ooh, like this thing looks super complicated. Like I could spend 20 hours digging into this, or I could see that like Mika Honkasalo and like Flipside voted on yes on this, and like they're really smart. So I'll probably go with them. That there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of just like I agree with most of your points, but that's also just kind of how life works, right? Like if I need a babysitter, right, I'm gonna if I have a friend that I trust that has great experience, like I'm not gonna go through all the diligence myself as if I met this person completely new. Same thing. So I think, but I do agree with your broader point that it's like Uber just raised a Series A, and we have external proxies debating on the forums about like what colors all the taxis have to be, or whether they can have like certain thresholds for what kind of cars. Like you don't need all of those people to be paid, or even to have that be a debate in the first place. So I think again it brings us back to this point of governance liability and the scope of governance, which I know has been discussed a lot, but yeah, I tend to agree, like introducing too many professional delegates that have a very large scope, it doesn't feel proper to me either. That said, I do think even with the protocols today, like it can be helpful to have external voices that aren't just your community or the team, because the reality is that a lot of big token holders don't participate. So if they don't participate, the alternative is what is the alternative? The alternative is either silence, or someone less qualified or less knowledgeable comes in to fill that void. So there's no perfect solutions. I don't think like a full-time professional set of delegates is an ideal world or should happen, but I do think like there's a lot of very obvious things that could be done by people that follow the protocol.
Here's I think my main problem with the I'm doing what I actually hate when others do, is just bring a bunch of problems and no solutions. But one of the issues with the delegate system in my mind is that there's minimal accountability for decisions. So like let's say how decisions are made internally at companies is like Blockworks, for example. Like if we have a chief revenue officer or something, and like they have a convicted view on like where we should take the sales side of our business, and we're going to let them do it because they're the chief revenue officer and like they're making a bold bet. But if they fail, like they could get fired, right? And like that's on that. Like, but they're high risk, high reward. In with these delegates, it's like there's minimal downside actually, and there's like a low level of accountability, I would say. So again, I don't have the solution, but it does feel like maybe that's the benefit of having these like committee-like systems where you have leaders. The leaders are accountable. The leaders can get removed from their places, which again sounds very much like teams and VP of marketing and a VP of sales inside of companies. But that's why I like this committee system, is not because it's more efficient, but actually because you end up with leaders who are incredibly accountable, that you can actually remove when things go poorly.
I think that's super important, right? Like if you have any sort of committee, right? Like that's necessary but not sufficient. Like you actually need the committee members to hold the people accountable, right? And similarly, like the idea was with a lot of the V1 DAOs, hey, token holders will keep people accountable. I think the reality though is most token holders are not equipped to keep people accountable. And two is accountability is it's tough, right? Because this is a cottage industry, right? So everyone knows everyone through one or two mutual connections. And if you are in a committee or if you're a large token holder and you're trying to keep someone accountable and they're not doing good work, you basically have to cross them and say, hey, I'm going to publicly out you. And if you have a social relationship with this person or entity, it becomes awkward, right? It's just very, very awkward. And I think there's like a lot of research that basically says, accountability, it either works when all of the individuals, they really give a shit, right? Like it's really important to them personally to be accountable. Or B, when you have the people who are holding the people accountable, they're outsiders, not just independent folks, but outsiders who actually want to do the right thing, right? And to keep people accountable. So it's a really, really tough problem. And companies, I think, have the same sort of issues. And there's all sorts of academic research on it. And I doubt that we'll, as an industry, be the first ones to solve that.
All right, everyone, brief break in the show here to talk about our newest sponsor, Reserve. So, it's looking pretty bleak out there. It's not looking that great. We know the one thing there's no bear market in?
Stable coins.
Stables, baby. Stables. We love those stable coins, which is why we're excited to partner with Reserve Protocol. So let's just start with the basics. What is Reserve? It's a self-service platform to build, deploy, and govern asset-backed stablecoins, which can be integrated with DeFi or within the real economy. So the cool thing about Reserve is basically anyone out there permissionlessly can take any set of ERC20 tokens and use them to collateralize their own stablecoin. So the long-term goal of the Reserve Protocol is to create a non-inflationary currency that is stable on a month-to-month basis, but also a century-to-century basis. In the meantime, though, they're open sourcing design decisions for stablecoins, which is just super, super cool. I think one of the benefits that you get there is diversification. You hear it all the time in Finance 101, no such thing as a free lunch except for diversification. That's what you're getting with Reserve Protocol.
Yeah. I've known the team for a long time. I spoke on a panel at SF Blockchain Week with Nevin, with Joe Carlson and Alex Gladstein. Really impressive growth that they've been able to have so far, right? Their premier stablecoin is RSV. It is backed by 3 other stables. It's already used by over 500,000 people, transacting over $300 million a month. Right now, like Mike was talking about, anyone can go create a custom bespoke stablecoin using the Reserve Protocol. You can back it by maybe specific USD stables, or you can get creative and maybe build something more complex like inversely correlated assets. The branding, governance, and composition are completely up to you.
And lastly, if there are any builders who are listening and you aren't interested in issuing your own stablecoin, what you can do is you can stake Reserve's governance token against your favorite stable strategies. So what you're doing there is you're providing backstop insurance to stablecoin holders. Not riskless, right? Not financial advice. There's definitely some risk in doing that, but it does allow you to earn yield, especially now in crypto when there are so few ways to do that. It's definitely worth checking out. So at the very least, you should click the link at the bottom of this episode. Go check out the Reserve website. See all the cool stuff they're up to. Most importantly, though, click this link. You got to give Jason and me some credit here.
Show us some love. Show us some love.
Give us some love, baby. Give us some love. All right. Now back to the show.
Let's get into it.
I want to... So a friend of mine pointed this out to me recently, and I thought it was pretty interesting. If you look up the definition of sabotage as defined by the OSS manual, I want to give you a couple of tactics for sabotage that's actually employed by the CIA. And you tell me if this reminds you of anything. When possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make the committees as large as possible, never fewer than 5. Bring up irrelevant issues as frequently as possible. Haggle over precise wordings of communications, minutes, resolutions. In making work assignments, always assign unimportant jobs first. Assign important jobs to inefficient workers with poor machines. To lower morale and with it production, be pleasant to inefficient workers, give them undeserved promotions, discriminate against efficient workers, complain unjustly about their work. Hold meetings when there is more critical work to be done. There's a longer list, but it is remarkable to me how the definition of sabotage, as defined basically by the CIA, lines up with many people's personal experience with DAO governance. So I'd love to get your kind of take on that. You guys is getting your hands dirty working with a lot of DAOs, and you guys work with phenomenal organizations, I will say. But in my opinion, one of the things that you're trying to optimize for at a high level of a company is good decision making. It's been said in other podcasts, on this podcast before, that actually there's a big element of like regulatory arbitrage that is trying to be optimized for, especially in early stage DAOs. So I'd love to get both of your opinions on this. I mean, how efficient what are we really trying to optimize for here? Is it decision making? Is it regulatory arbitrage? Is it some middle ground in between? And how do we start making better decisions in these organizations?
Yeah, I'll get to the second question, but on the first one, yeah, that's one of my favorite memes, tweets about DAO governance that I've seen, and I've seen a lot. I actually bought the field manual on like the book itself, and flipped to that exact page, and I like taped it up to the wall as a reminder, I think, to myself really, about just like making sure that you care about the right things. And this isn't to say that certain voices don't matter or certain opinions don't matter, but I think when you have hundreds or thousands of people chiming in on certain things, if you're really listening and taking, like, being influenced by every single one of those, you're not going to do anything. And this applies to not just, it applies to everything, right? So I think it's important to like be aware of the different perspectives, but yeah, like getting too close and too personally invested and listening to like all these things, like, it's just not useful. So I think, yeah, I mean, in terms of your second question, like, how do we actually arrive at better decision making? I think it, again, comes back to the common theme of having the people that have the most context and the right incentives actually be the ones driving decision making. Generally speaking, for crypto protocols today that are young, that's going to be the team. As they continue to grow, I think that's when others with different specialized skill sets can come into the fold and provide specific value. I think you, again, generally at this point don't need the masses and thousands or tens of thousands of people chiming in, and having that is usually more of a downside than a pro at this point.
Larry, any thoughts there?
I totally agree. I think some people would argue, hey, if we have a bunch of people sitting at the table, we're going to get to the wisdom of the crowds, right? We're going to have the crowd make a collective decision, and it's going to be great. I can count on one hand out of thousands of decisions we've seen how many times that has happened. It usually becomes too many cooks in the kitchen, right? Which is the inverse of wisdom of the crowds, and that's a huge problem.
The other thing is, it's not even just wisdom of the crowds. Like, time is probably the most important factor, right? Like, we don't have endless amounts of time to decide on a single decision. DAOs and protocols and apps that can arrive at the decision quicker will, again, over a long enough time frame, win. Even if that is a worse decision, maybe than one that takes like months to arrive at. So I think iteration and rapid decision making is really important. Yeah.
I have a I want to start talking about, Jason and I have annotated this multiple times throughout this season. This was one of the hardest topics that we've dug into, to find people saying positive thinks about. Basically, we do research before going to these seasons, and it's been basic. It was very easy to find people pointing out the problems with the current status quo, but it's harder to find people who are willing to prescribe solutions, probably because, I think you could imagine, and I want to get into this piece that Vitalik wrote about some of the advantages to DAOs and where a DAO might differ from a corporation in its ultimate objective and why a more decentralized, maybe surface minimized approach to governance could make sense. But I think bridging the gap from point A to point B is very unclear. And I'd love to maybe highlight some of the models, right? The early attempts that we've taken at bridging that gap. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the council structure that Reverie proposed at Orca and how that might solve some of these challenges.
Yeah, I'd be happy to chat through that. And none of it is really all that complicated or rocket science, but some context is Orca is an AMM on Solana, one of the top AMMs on there. And we were basically trying to brainstorm with the team, hey, how do we create the most effective product for users? To Derek's point, I think the number one thing we think about is product, right? Because without that, you're kind of screwed. And we're also thinking about how do we avoid some of the pitfalls other DAOs have fallen into, and in particular, how do we make sure that they're able to iterate and move quickly, right? Because to Derek's point, in an early stage company, the most important thing is product and quick iteration times and just speed and speed to market. And so what we basically created is a little bit of a hybrid between, a typical corporate governance structure and maybe a direct democracy, which a lot of the DAOs are. And the idea is basically the token holders elect the council, and the council can then have some powers, right? Like make new proposals, right? Have access to the treasury, stuff like that. But at all times, token holders have ultimate control, so that if the council is acting rogue or if token holders disagree with how the council is actually proceeding, they will have a veto, right? And so there's always that fail-safe at the end of the day, such that if council is not doing something well, the token holders can have ultimate say. That's the high-level summary of the structure. It's not that complicated. We think it's not a perfect structure by any means, but it's probably better than the status quo. And really, what we're trying to optimize for is speed and having the best product in the market. And I think that's what we've come up with for Orca.
And I'm curious, how has the response been, I guess, both within Orca, but also within maybe some of the circles that you travel within other communities? Do you get the sense that DAOs writ large are looking at council structures as, I know it's run into some headwinds in Maker, but like council-like structures at either Maker or Orca, and our DAOs saying, hey, this is like actually pretty interesting, and maybe as a contributor to a DAO, I'm been extremely frustrated by how hamstrung it is to make decisions at this organization? Or do you sort of run into, I don't want to say ideologues, some mix of ideologues or entrenched incumbents who might have different interests or a different ideology for how a DAO might look? Like, what has the response been?
At Orca, it's been really good. I think that the token holder and just the community there in general is, and I would say in general, the Solana community is much more, hey, let's move quickly and break things sort of mindset, rather than the Ethereum community, which is much more ideological about decentralization. And these are just trade-offs, right? Like we personally at Reverie don't have strong opinions on which community is better or worse, but there's certainly trade-offs. So Orca, there's really not been too much pushback, but I think a lot of the pushback at other projects we've seen, which is fair, by the way, is, hey, these committees that are being formed or these councils, right? They're not putting in the right people. They're putting in the people who are there to, basically profiteer for their own benefit, right? And I think that's where the big pushback is fine, we're totally on board with moving quickly and iterating on product, but we don't think you chose the right people. These people are paying themselves too much and doing no work, right? And I think that's a very valid criticism. So it really just comes down to, are the people who have power, are they good people? Do they give a shit, right? Are they aligned over the long term, or are they just making very short-term decisions? And that's really hard to suss out.
I have I'd like to sort of transition here, just moving through our list of topics into kind of what you view as being the ultimate value proposition for DAOs, maybe how, and contrast that with how, the corporate model for governance, because trying to get at kind of an end game of why we are embarking on this great experiment in governance, right? And is there a purpose? Is governance Derek, I heard you use this phrase. I know Hsue's used this phrase in the past. Governance is a liability, right? And to some extent, if I were at Reverie and I were interacting with some of these communities on a day-to-day basis, I might have a very similar perspective, but I'm trying to think like there's a reason why we're doing this, right? If we were just trying to replicate exactly corporate governance, then what are we all doing here? So maybe on the spectrum of, all the way on the left over here, we've got governance is a liability because I have to run everything through this crazy decision-making process that just hampers good decision-making. And then maybe in the middle of the spectrum, it's kind of neutral, right? There are some pros to it and there are some cons, but they ultimately kind of balance out. And then all the way on the right side of the spectrum is ultimately, maybe not for every product, but in some very specific cases for a certain type of product, either based on maturity or where it sits on the infrastructure layer, this very decentralized structure of governance is actually quite beneficial, and governance ceases to become a liability and it becomes an asset. I'd love to get your sense, end game wise, where you think governance ultimately ends up falling on that spectrum.
I think in the long run, the ideal governance platform is the one that lets the best ideas win. And again, I think that's a little vague. It's like if you dig into what does that actually mean? And I think it comes back to a question earlier you said, which is like, okay, what are the actual strengths of DAOs? Like, what are some of the positive attributes they have? How can they actually compete versus other organizations? And to me, the big one is openness, right? Openness in the sense that anyone can join a DAO, whether it's what that means, it doesn't, I don't know, like it depends. But anyone can try to voice their opinion and contribute. And I think today it's very hard for like an average person with no context to join a DAO like Uniswap and have influence, but it is still nonetheless possible. And we have seen anons with no backgrounds, no names, no prestige, like come into large protocols and have a lot of influence just because they have good ideas. So to me, I think the key over the long run is making sure that the right ideas are surfaced and empowered while, minimizing the amount of bureaucracy and debate. And I think it's inevitable, like some degree of that. But I think it's, again, I think in an end state of DAOs, it's much better for like ideas across the world to be surfaced and used than with a closed company that doesn't do anything transparently or in public. So I think we're very far from that reality today, but I think that is sort of the end goal.
I'd be curious. I'd love to, Vitalik laid something pretty interesting out in this piece that he wrote, and he expressly responded to this idea that DAOs are not corporations. It's the title of the piece. DAOs are not corporations. And he basically laid out three distinct advantages to DAOs, which is decentralized decision-making in concave environments, decentralization for censorship resistance, and decentralization for credible neutrality. I do wonder, so we're talking largely about decision-making in the context of early-stage startups, where you want really fast decision-making because, honestly, in basically every startup, there are multiple bet the kitchen sink moments that founders need to make. And those are almost by definition unpopular decisions and difficult ones to make. And those, as Vitalik defines them, are convex decisions, right? It's basically a coin flip, either it works or not, and the benefit of the thing working vastly outstrips the, it failing. And basically every company has to make that in the early stages. I think using his framework, it actually, I think within organizations, decisions largely start out as you want to be optimizing for convex outcomes, which is binary bet the farm type things. But over a certain period of time, you want them to look more concave because it's basically kind of a probability thing, right? If you centralize the decision making, the power with one entity, if they are able to keep doing coin flips, right, to bet the company, odds are eventually they will fail. And you're kind of seeing this in Meta right now. This is playing out in corporate governance, actually, much more interestingly even than what's going on in crypto, because Mark Zuckerberg has a share structure that allows him to keep making these sorts of bets. So actually, I think you could kind of see, yeah, we'll see how that all kind of plays out in corporate America. But I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this idea of convex versus concave decision making, and in some cases, is it actually a benefit, right, Larry? Like you were kind of alluding to at the beginning of this episode, what are the instances in our world, in crypto DAO land, where slower decision making can ultimately be a benefit? Maybe we could start to apply it to some of these protocols.
Yeah, like I read the piece several times, and candidly, I didn't fully digest it, but I think I get the general gist, right? Which is, if you're a startup, right, you really have not much to lose. You basically have your shingle and your reputation, which is not much. You may as well bet the farm every single time, right? And when you're big and you have a bunch to lose, you're not going to want to risk everything, which is why like large companies, they don't make big risky decisions, and as a result, they sort of fade into irrelevance, right? And I think that that's totally true. But my sense is most of the projects that we're thinking about in the DAO space, they look more like startups, right, than large companies that have a lot to lose, right? Ethereum is probably more like a large company than the dApps we're referring to. And in those cases, the dApp cases, they probably should bet the farm, more often than not, because they really don't have much to lose in doing so. That's kind of how I think about it at a high level.
Yeah. I also I want to aggressively advocate some positive stuff here. So let's talk about one thing that I do. So like Jason and I, in some of those bet the farm decision making actions that have occurred at Blockworks in the past, Jason and I have this like informal thing called a brain trust, where it's like, all right, we got to make a decision that's extremely impactful for the outcome of this organization, oftentimes in areas where we're not necessarily experts, right? So we have a brain trust of people that we trust, which I joke about this, but honestly, it's on my list, is my dad. And like, all right, I'll talk to my dad, you talk to your dad. And then also like whatever friends that we might have that are within these subject areas. Employees, if you're listening to Blockworks, we don't do this anymore, but like this was a real thing for like a period of time. And one thing that has really has been interesting to me, or I could see the advantage of, is if you had direct access, right, via the community to this your core kind of power user, right? And you're like, hey guys, maybe we're not floating capital allocation decisions by you, or like long-term strategic roadmap or sectors that we want to play in, but it's like, we've got this product, we're thinking about doing feature X, Y, or Z. I'm actually wondering, I think you could kind of get some useful if you filter through the crap, I think you could actually get some pretty useful product iteration and feedback, where you could avoid making mistakes like Netflix did with Quickster, if you remember when they tried to separate the DVDs and the streaming service way too early, right? And even though Reed was ultimately right on that, if he had a freaking Discord of his most loyal customers, he could have probably gotten some feedback that could have saved that stock a 90% drop, if you remember. And they recovered and it was fine. But that's what I'm kind of wondering, if like some access to a community, if you weed out some of the responses, could it be useful for product iteration?
I know we were a little bit, pessimistic on DAOs, but I, I'm, and I am, and I know Reverie is. We're very bullish on them actually, right? And the reason we're bullish on them is we see all these problems, right? And we see solutions to them, right? And to your point, like one big benefit of DAOs, and Derek mentioned this, is they are open, right? So the users are in Discord, they are in the forums, and they're constantly telling you what they don't like about the product. That's kind of cool, right? And I think the DAO teams that look at that and actually iterate on that feedback, they will do really damn well. I also think like the fact that DAOs are kind of internet native organizations that anyone in the world can join and coordinate around this token. It really is a hotbed for talent. And so it attracts really, really good talent that would otherwise be really difficult to incentivize to come join. So there's so many awesome, I think, tailwinds that DAOs have, but there's immense problems as well. But I think a lot of the teams that work on DAOs and really try hard and are rigorous about the work they do, um, they see all these problems and they look at them as things to solve, right? And that's the most important thing, I think, is to address the problems and fix them. And I think the good DAOs will fix those issues over time.
Guys, who do you think is right to be a DAO right now? So if you look at a lot of the DAOs today, it's a lot of the brands were started in like 2018, 2019. They really boomed in DeFi summer. After DeFi summer, we saw a lot of DeFi brands or organizations raise capital as DAOs. But really now, if you look at a lot of them, they're these 10 to 50 person startups that don't really operate as DAOs. And now if you look at a lot of the decks and a lot of the companies that are raising, there's like no DAO, like very few DAOs that are raising. I'm just curious how you guys think. It seems like your North Star for like why DAO is it's a new evolution of like corporate structure built for this world that's incredibly open, incredibly global, digital first. So I'm just curious, like, how you think about who is right for a DAO, and like, do you think we'll get the resurgence of like founders raising as from the start as a DAO in the next bull market? And I'm just curious how you think about that.
Yeah, I think the short answer is there's only some use cases within crypto where competing on decentralization and openness makes your product better. I think the mistake that has been made a lot is, yeah, let's make everything a DAO, like every single use case in crypto, from trading to lending and borrowing to gaming to middleware. Like, let's just try all of it. Let's just make it a DAO, right? And I think it's clear that with a lot of those services, right? Like the thing, if you want like maybe reliability, maybe if you want like customer support, if you want like insurance, like you probably don't need a DAO, at least for now. It's probably just not even possible. So I think it just really has to be the right use cases. And yeah, I think over time we will see a resurgence of folks building DAOs, raising on that thesis. But I definitely think we're in a bit of a trough, the same way that after the 2017 like ICO boom, there was probably 2 to 3 years where tokens were deeply unpopular, and the industry was like, again, I'm generalizing, like it was really only just Bitcoin and Ethereum. And then in 2020, we sort of had a resurgence in tokens. So again, many of which are not useful and are not sustainable, but I think there's a handful or more that are interesting and people and are doing something new. So I think we're just a few years behind that with DAOs, where it is difficult to point to one today and be like, that's an amazing example, everything's going super well. But if you zoom out and go ahead 2 3 years, like I do think that will happen. So
It's amazing, Derek. Leading up to this season, I actually went back and looked at some emails and texts, and unfortunately, public tweets that I had sent about tokens in 2019, and like I was about as bearish as you can get on tokens in 2019. And again, this is like a year and a half into the bear, like absolute bottom of the market. Everyone's basically saying like, is crypto even going to work? And it feels I hadn't put that together of like my take on tokens back then is kind of like how a lot of people are viewing DAOs today, which is like DAOs are dumb. No, yeah. So I like that.
Derek. Like the intellectual like discussions on Twitter, on Telegram, like that, like they're just discussions. It changes so quickly. Most of the largest like token users, token holders today, at some point in the last 2 3 years, like for 4 or 5 years, we're huge Bitcoin bulls, right? And nothing else.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
like it's human nature, I think, when you see a ton of to be like counter cyclical and to be contrarian, when you see and I think, yeah, anyone that saw like all the DAO raises in 2020, 2021, like didn't take a rocket scientist to be like, some of these don't need to be DAOs. And I think people feel justified that a lot of that is playing out the way that they thought. But I think, again, it's times like these where like the folks that do believe that realize there is some utility to DAOs and protocols, like I think those are the ones that will be well positioned in the next cycle, whatever that means for you. So
one thing I'd add is I think anyone who's worked at a large company, like a Fortune 500 company, knows how dysfunctional corporate America and just corporations are, right? Like there's all these meetings, all these all hands, right? All of these weird hierarchical things. And oftentimes, if you're a junior person, you have really good ideas. You're not going to communicate those ideas up to the CEO. First of all, you probably don't have access to the CEO. And second of all, even if you did, you wouldn't have the chutzpah to tell the CEO what problems the company is facing, right? And there's all sorts of stuff that companies have challenges with, right? Because people don't let the problems really, there's no escape valve, right, for the problems. And with DAOs, I think, and this is something I think is really bullish for them, is there's a huge escape valve for the problems, right? Forums and Discord. So at all times, all of the ugliness is out there, right? And I think that's like half the battle, is just identifying the problems and saying, hey, this shit's not working. Someone needs to fix it. Most companies do not have that escape valve, and and they still function, by the way. Like it still works despite all these huge problems, and DAOs too, right? Like a lot of them have all these problems. They still work just fine, right? The products are kicking ass, and maybe they're not moving as quickly as they should, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good either. So I think there's a lot of really good things for DAOs as well.
I think that question of product iteration and to exactly what we were talking about, the direct feedback filtering all the way up. I can give you a very concrete example of how that actually helped our business. We, host conferences, and we had hosted DAS for a long time. That's our institutional conference. And the selling point there, it's for banks and hedge funds and regulators. And the selling point is exclusivity, right? Like all of the verbiage of the conference was basically around this idea of exclusivity and a very high quality of attendee. We hosted permissionless with Bankless this previous year, and we borrowed from that, right? We didn't, we have like VIP this and VIP that, and we submitted these proposals to like Uniswap, and I remember we just got shredded in this. And if we had submitted this proposal to a marketer, we probably could have got this like, oh yeah, this looks like really interesting. Let me take it up the chain, and then we wouldn't have gotten responded to for a couple weeks, and then it would have been like, I really advocated for you, but it's a no. The community was like, we'll never sign anything that's like exclusive. We don't want that. We want this to be a community event. And we pivoted and we changed our entire marketing message. We changed how the event was laid out. And it was honestly super valuable, extremely direct feedback that completely changed an enormous product for us. So that's like, honestly, it's kind of annoying, but we were able to weed out some of the signal from the noise. So it's helped us in the past. I'm
laughing because man,
you remember that? I remember that.
Comments were ruthless, guys. You should have seen this.
Look it up. It's in governance. Yeah, you can look it up on. They're pretty funny. So I've got one more kind of technical question for you, and then I want to get to some recommendations, because I always think about Reverie. You guys are practitioners, right? And there are people that are out there that are maybe leaders in DAOs or contributors to communities, and I'd love to walk away with some sort of actionable advice from this interview. But I also, one thing that occurs to me is there like a narrative right now that's been kind of playing out. It's a narrative, but it's actually a very real struggle for like what model's going to ultimately be successful is kind of app chains versus layer twos as a way of scaling on Ethereum. And I think DAOs play a role in this and that form of governance, because if you think about something like an app chain, you're trying to vertically integrate and build the full stack, right? Like a project like Osmosis is building the exchange, but also like products on top of that customers are going to want to use. And that's entirely based on DAO governance, right? DAO governance is making all the decisions that goes into that, the base and the product. If you look at something like Uniswap, right? There's a different sort of model, which is, okay, we want the base DEX layer to be governed by a DAO, but then there's going to be a labs, which is company, right, which is building on top of that, which allows for a little bit more rapid product iteration and fast decision making. So I'd be curious to get your understanding of how governance, these the pros and cons of DAO governance play into this app chain versus ETH scaling kind of roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people have app chains are obviously a super big topic right now. There's been a lot of writing about the benefits, whether it's with regards to MEV approaches, scalability, technical design, and others. And yeah, if you boil it down, it comes down to whatever innovations crypto has in the future, app chains will be the ones that can actually leverage them and implement them. Whereas on other L1s, they might have less optionality. So I think, yeah, generally speaking, like app chains, the thesis really is like modular governance and having more direct control. It like enables certain use cases that aren't possible on Ethereum. But I do think over time, Ethereum L2s, like they will change as well. Like you look at Optimism, you look at Arbitrum, and some of the other L2s today. Like I think they're very closely aligned with Ethereum, and it's very important for them. But again, I think over a long enough time frame, those communities will grow, and they will start to think about their own long-term positioning and making sure that regardless of what Ethereum or like does, that they're well positioned. So I'm not saying that I think L2s will be like necessarily hostile to Ethereum or other protocols, but I think like as they grow, they'll have their own stakeholders that don't necessarily hold ETH, and we should expect them to act on their incentives. So
I was just to maybe clarify one minor thing there. I was kind of trying to refer to this idea of like if DAO governance is a liability, then it seems like app chains are actually slightly more exposed to that liability today than the roadmap that some of the dApps on ETH have taken. Because if you think about Uniswap, right, like there's the kind of base layer DEX, but then you have this layer on top. There are two separate forms of governance there where products, right, that users actually interface with are going to be created mostly by Uniswap Labs, right, which has that more authoritative, like rapid iteration type governance structure, whereas for an app chain, it's entirely done through DAO governance. So that was my like. Do you see that? Is that like an apt analogy to use then? Like more exposure to DAO governance liability in the app chain side, or do you not think that's a factor?
I understand the framing, and I think it has some truths, but again, I think it comes down to optionality, right? Like app chains, having an app chain doesn't necessarily mean that every part of the stack is directly controlled by governance. I think like app chain creators and builders have the option on which parts to decentralize and which parts to centralize. I think if you take the app chain vision to its extreme, where everything from the consensus to the front end, like it's all as decentralized as possible, then it's obviously the scope of governance is much bigger. So I think app chains, there's definitely more governance generally, but I think it's more about, I think of it more as having more optionality in how to like use that governance.
Let's maybe in terms of, I know we're a little limited on time here, but I'd love to get to some more kind of prescriptive or practical advice. Larry, I know you wrote this piece for Reverie. Basically, we'll link it in the show notes, but it's called Musings on Governance, and there's some kind of actionable, you sort of lay out some problem areas or some issues for DAOs, or that a lot of DAOs are sort of struggling with, and then kind of what Reverie's prescription would be, right, for how to move forward or how to think about it. There are a couple that you laid out. So treasuries. So treasuries aren't funds or endowments or other pools of capital. The interesting issue of sometimes contributors having outside agendas or undisclosed interests, committees diluting accountability, conflicts of are basically governance being politics and not necessarily shying away from that. So I'd love to get your kind of thoughts on what you think some of the most important issues that DAOs are facing today, And as maybe prescriptive as you want to be, like how would you advise DAOs that you're working on for dealing with them?
I think the number one thing, like by far, is to have the right people sitting at the table, right? So the decision makers need to be chosen very carefully, at least in the early stages. The risk in not doing so, and we've seen this a lot, right? And I'm sure you guys have as well, is when you introduce too many cooks in the kitchen, it becomes analysis paralysis and decision making grinds to a halt, right? And so I think early on, it's really important for the team, like the early stage team, to basically say, okay, we are clearly the best people for the job, right? We have the most context, the most experience, the most history, the most vision, and over time bring people on board very selectively. I think that's like by far the biggest thing. If you don't do that, right, and you empower just completely random people, um, it becomes a quagmire, like a political quagmire. And I think the competent people, the people who actually want to do really good work, they see that political quagmire and they just don't want to sling mud, right? It's not interesting to them. They just want to do cool stuff, right, and be productive. And as a result, when they see it, they leave. And I think that's really, really dangerous to DAOs. So the number one thing we'd recommend is always have the team be really involved in figuring out who's sitting at that table initially.
I'd love to actually get your, like, totally agree with that. Maybe if I could pick on your thoughts for DAO treasuries, actually specifically, because there's a lot of discussion around them. I think, like you, what you wrote really resonated with me because if you look at how treasuries are managed in corporate America, it's basically you want the finances of the business to not impact or support the operating decisions of the business, right? So that's why corporate treasurers tend to be very risk averse, and most of your assets are basically just want to keep up with inflation, right? That's why they're in very short dated treasuries with, like, and you're not taking basically outsized risk. The way that I've kind of heard DAO treasuries talked about sometimes is, oh yeah, we're going to engage in all these complex derivative structures, which is like delta neutral yield farming and all this stuff. And I'm just like, are you optimizing what you should be optimizing for there, which is just to not run out of money? And, so I'd love to get your kind of thoughts on how you think we're going to see that field evolve.
This is a huge pet peeve of mine, right? Like having DAOs manage treasuries like hedge funds. Like DAOs should not be using their balance sheet capital, right, their treasury, to make risky bets, to make venture investments, to buy all these hedges, right, to invest in derivatives, because investors basically give money to DAOs, right? And if investors wanted to do all that stuff themselves, they would have done it. The reason they invested in the DAO is because they believe in whatever that DAO is doing. They're not investing in the DAO to do all sorts of, hedge fund activities. And I think when you see that sort of stuff, a lot of it is, just service providers trying to bamboozle the DAO, right, and make a personal dollar. And, you see this in the traditional world too. And I think, unfortunately, you see it in DAO land. But, I think most of the well-run DAOs, they don't engage in that sort of stuff. In fact, I don't think any of them do. And it's really the DAOs that don't know better, that they use their balance sheet, their treasury as a hedge fund, and it's obviously a huge problem in the space, right? It's a honeypot of money, so people are attracted to it. But I think you're right. Like DAOs should be extremely risk averse when it comes to that sort of stuff. They should just hold some cash reserves for runway, right? Maybe 2 to 3 years, 2 to 4 years, and not speculate with the rest.
Guys, I would love the audience can tell, right? I think just from our chat so far that you really have a deep understanding of working with these DAOs communities, kind of getting your hands dirty on the ground. But can you just tell everyone a little bit about what Reverie is, and if folks want to follow more of your work or find out more about the work that you do or connect or whatever it is, like what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, the best way to understand Reverie is to understand Derek and I's background. We were former VCs in this space. I was at Digital Currency Group. Derek was at Blockchain Capital, and we were investing in a lot of startups. And as a result, we were not able to get super hands-on with any one company, and we wanted to do things completely differently at Reverie. And so instead, what we do is we get super hands-on with very few companies at any given time. And, at a high level, what Reverie is, it's an advisory business and an investing business. So we get super hands-on with a few companies. Most of them are DAOs, but we work with companies too. And we basically are operators in the trenches alongside the team. And then we make small investments as well.
Awesome, guys. Well, I will I show one more part of your business, which is the I Pledge Allegiance podcast as well, which is phenomenal. Listeners to on the margin and bell curve have probably heard this podcast, I Pledge Allegiance. The lot of I Pledge Allegiance references. So you guys have done great work, especially kind of fleecing out some of these ideas about DAOs and governance. So I highly recommend listeners, if you enjoy this program, especially this season, if there was a godfather to this season, kind of a guiding light, it was definitely you guys and the work that you're doing at I Pledge Allegiance. So, it was an honor to have both of you on the show. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we'll have to do it again soon.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks a lot, Jason.
Thanks, Derek.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Larry.
Had a ton of fun.
Cheers, fellas.